March 15, 2015, Royal Albert Hall, London. Eric Clapton was performing his famous song for a charity concert benefiting deaf education. A sign language interpreter stood at the side of the stage, translating the lyrics for the deaf audience. But when Clapton sang the famous opening line, the interpreter did something that made Clapton stop mid-song. She didn't just sign the words, she signed a name, Patty, and then she signed George's wife. Clapton stared at her. The interpreter looked back at him with tears in her eyes and signed, "I know who Layla really is. I know what this song cost you, and I know she's here tonight." Clapton looked into the audience, and there, 3 rows back, sat Patty Boyd, the woman he'd been obsessively in love with for decades, the woman he'd written the song about, the woman who was his best friend's wife. The interpreter had recognized her and had just exposed the secret meaning of the song to everyone. Eric Clapton was performing a special charity concert to benefit the National Deaf Children's Society. It was a cause close to his heart. One of his daughters had been born with hearing difficulties, and he'd become passionate about supporting deaf education and accessibility. The concert was sold out. 3,000 people filled the historic venue. But what made this concert unique was that approximately 200 seats in the orchestra section had been reserved for members of the deaf community. And standing at the side of the stage, visible to both the deaf audience and to Clapton, was a professional sign language interpreter who would translate the entire concert. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. She was 38 years old and had been a professional sign language interpreter for 15 years. She'd translated hundreds of concerts, theater performances, and public events. She knew how to convey not just words, but emotion, tone, atmosphere. She was exceptional at her job. Sarah had prepared extensively for this concert. She'd studied Clapton's discography, memorized lyrics, researched the stories behind the songs. She wanted the deaf audience to experience not just the words, but the meaning, the history, the emotional weight of Clapton's music. She knew about Patty Boyd. Every Clapton fan knew about Patty Boyd. Patty had been a model in 1960s London, stunningly beautiful. She'd met George Harrison on the set of A Hard Day's Night in 1964. They married in 1966. She became George Harrison's wife, one of the Beatles' wives, one of the most photographed and envied women in the world. Eric Clapton met Patty through George. They were best friends, close as brothers, and Clapton fell desperately, obsessively in love with George's wife. For years, Clapton said nothing. The love was impossible, forbidden, painful. He channeled it into music. In 1970, he wrote a song about his obsessive, unrequited love for his best friend's wife. He called it Layla, from a Persian love story about impossible love. The song became one of the most famous rock songs ever written. Everyone knew it. But most people didn't know what it was really about. They didn't know Layla was Patty Boyd. They didn't know the anguish in the song was real. They didn't know Clapton had been on his knees, literally, begging Patty to leave George and be with him. Eventually, in the mid-1970s, Patty and George divorced, and in 1979, Patty married Eric Clapton. The impossible love became possible. But it didn't last. Their marriage was difficult, complicated by Clapton's alcoholism, his infidelities, his emotional unavailability. They divorced in 1989. By 2015, both Clapton and Patty had moved on with their lives. They were civil, they'd made peace, but they rarely saw each other. Sarah knew all of this history. She'd researched it while preparing for the concert. She knew that when Clapton performed his famous song, the deaf audience should understand what it really meant, not just the words, the story. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Patty Boyd would be in the audience that night. The concert began at 8 p.m. Clapton opened with crowd favorites. Sarah signed along, her hands fluid and expressive, conveying not just words, but the feeling of each song. The deaf audience watched her intently, experiencing the music through her interpretation. 90 minutes into the concert, Clapton spoke to the audience. "This next song," he said, "is probably the one I'm asked about most often. I wrote it a long time ago, about someone who mattered very much to me. It's a song about love that seemed impossible at the time." Sarah signed his words, and then she glanced at the audience to gauge their reaction. That's when she saw her. Row 3, slightly left of center. A woman with distinctive features, high cheekbones, striking eyes, blonde hair now streaked with gray. Sarah recognized her immediately from the photographs she'd seen during her research. Patty Boyd. The Patty Boyd, the woman the song was about. Sarah's heart started racing. She looked back at Clapton, who was adjusting his guitar, preparing to begin. Did he know Patty was here? Had she told him she was coming? Or was this going to be a surprise for both of them? The opening notes began, that distinctive, instantly recognizable guitar riff that everyone in the world knew. Clapton began singing. Sarah faced a decision. She could translate the lyrics literally, just the words, the way she'd planned. The deaf audience would experience a beautiful song about love and longing. Or she could translate the truth, tell them what the song really meant, who it was really about, and that the woman who inspired it was sitting right there. It violated every professional boundary. Interpreters were supposed to be invisible, neutral, faithful to the source material. They weren't supposed to add context or make editorial decisions about meaning. But Sarah thought about the deaf audience, about how hearing people had experienced this song for 45 years, knowing the story, understanding the subtext, feeling the weight of the real emotions behind it. The deaf community deserved that same depth of understanding.
And they deserved to know that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The subject of the song was in the room. Sarah made her decision. When Clapton sang the famous opening words, Sarah didn't sign Layla. She signed Patty. She spelled it out, Pattie. The deaf audience members closest to her looked confused. That wasn't the word in the song. Then Sarah signed George's wife, and then his best friend's wife. Understanding began to dawn on faces in the deaf section. They knew who George was, George Harrison, the Beatle. This was about George Harrison's wife? Sarah continued signing as Clapton sang, but she wasn't translating words, she was translating truth. He loved her for years. She was married to his closest friend. This song is his confession. It's about forbidden love. It's about obsession. It's about being on his knees begging. More people in the deaf section were understanding now. They started looking at each other with wide eyes, realizing what they were learning. Then Sarah did something even more dramatic. She pointed directly at Patty Boyd in row 3. She signed, "She's here, tonight, row 3. The deaf audience members turned to look, all of them, 200 people in the orchestra section turning their heads toward row 3. Patty Boyd suddenly found herself being stared at by 200 people. She realized what was happening. The interpreter was telling them the song was about her, telling them she was Patty. Patty's face flushed. She looked down at her hands, then back up at the stage. And that's when Clapton saw it. He was in the middle of singing when he noticed something odd. The deaf section, all of them, were turned away from the stage. They weren't watching him. They were looking at someone in the audience.
He followed their gaze and saw Patty. He hadn't known she was coming.
She'd bought a ticket without telling him. She'd wanted to hear the song about her, performed live one more time. She'd thought she could sit anonymously in the audience. But now, everyone knew. Clapton's voice faltered. He kept playing. Muscle memory carried him through the guitar part, but his singing stumbled. He looked at Sarah, the interpreter. Sarah was still signing, still telling the deaf audience the truth. He wrote this in 1970. She was still married to George. He couldn't have her. The pain in his voice is real. Not performance, truth. Clapton saw what she was signing. He could read enough sign language. He'd learned some basics while advocating for deaf education. He understood what Sarah was doing. She was exposing the song, revealing what it really meant to everyone. For 45 years, Clapton had performed this song while most of the audience didn't truly understand what it was about. They knew it was a love song. They knew it was passionate, but they didn't know the specific story. They didn't know about George, about Patty, about the years of impossible longing. Now, the deaf audience knew everything, and they were watching both Clapton and Patty simultaneously, the singer and the subject, experiencing the song with the full knowledge of its meaning. It was the most honest performance of the song Clapton had ever given, because pretense was impossible. Everyone knew. When the song ended, there was a moment of silence. Then the hearing audience erupted in applause. They'd heard a great performance of a classic song. But the deaf audience's response was different. They didn't clap. They raised their hands and shook them, the deaf community's way of applauding. And they were looking at Clapton with expressions of profound understanding. They'd experienced something the hearing audience hadn't. They'd experienced the truth. After the concert, Sarah was brought backstage. She expected to be fired, or at least reprimanded. She'd violated professional standards. She'd made the performance about the story behind the song, rather than the song itself. Clapton was waiting for her in his dressing room. "You told them," he said simply. "Yes, I'm sorry if I overstepped, but I saw Patty in the audience, and I thought..." "You thought the deaf community deserved to know what the song really meant." "Yes."
Clapton was quiet for a moment. "You were right. I've performed that song thousands of times, and most of the time I'm hiding behind it, hiding behind the poetry of the lyrics, letting people think it's just a song. But it's not just a song. It's a confession. It's the most honest thing I ever wrote. And tonight, for the first time, I performed it while everyone understood that. I saw you falter when you realized Patty was there. I didn't know she'd come. We don't see each other often. When I saw her and saw the deaf audience looking at her and saw you signing the truth, I couldn't hide anymore. I had to sing it honestly. Was that difficult? Terrifying and liberating." Clapton smiled slightly. The deaf audience experienced something tonight that hearing audiences never do. They experienced the song with full context. They saw me. They saw her. They knew the history. They understood the weight. "Are you angry with me?" "No, I'm grateful. You gave me something I didn't know I needed. The experience of performing that song without pretense, just truth." Later that evening, Sarah learned that Patty Boyd had requested to meet her. They met in a quiet corner of the venue after most people had left. "You pointed at me," Patty said, not accusatory, just stating fact. "I did. I'm sorry if that made you uncomfortable." "It did, but it also felt right. That song has followed me my whole life. Everyone knows it's about me, but there's usually this polite fiction that we don't talk about it directly. Tonight, you removed that fiction." "Do you regret coming to the concert?" "No, I came because I wanted to hear Eric sing it one more time. We're both old now. Who knows how many more times he'll perform it. I wanted to be there. I just didn't expect to be revealed. The deaf audience deserved to understand what they were experiencing. Patty nodded slowly. You're right. And maybe Eric and I both needed to experience it that way. Honestly, no hiding. I was the impossible love. He was the man who loved me when he couldn't have me. The song is our story. Tonight, for the first time, we both acknowledged that publicly. She paused. The deaf community is lucky. They have you telling them the truth. The hearing world just hears a beautiful song, but they don't always understand what they're hearing. Sarah smiled. Sometimes silence reveals more than sound ever could. In 2016, Clapton gave an interview about the charity concert. The interviewer asked about the sign language interpreter. She did something extraordinary, Clapton said. She didn't just translate the words, she translated the meaning, the history, the truth. And because of her, the deaf audience experienced my song more deeply than most hearing audiences ever have. They saw through the poetry to the confession underneath. They understood that when I wrote about being on my knees, I meant it literally. That when I wrote about impossible love, I was writing about a specific person who was married to my best friend.
That must have been difficult to perform with that level of exposure. It was. But it was also honest. I've spent 45 years performing that song while maintaining a certain distance from what it really means. That night, I couldn't maintain that distance. The deaf audience knew everything, and that forced me to sing it truthfully. No performance, just confession. Today, Sarah Mitchell continues to work as a sign language interpreter. She's become something of a legend in the deaf community for what she did that night at Royal Albert Hall. Some professional interpreters criticized her for overstepping boundaries. Others praised her for prioritizing deep understanding over literal translation. Sarah doesn't regret her decision. My job is to make the arts accessible to the deaf community. And accessibility doesn't just mean translating words, it means translating meaning, context, truth. The hearing audience got to experience that song with decades of context, magazine articles, interviews, public knowledge about Clapton and Patty's history. Why shouldn't the deaf audience have that same context? Why should they experience a lesser version of the art? Eric Clapton is 79 now and has officially retired from touring. He's performed his famous song thousands of times over 5 decades, but the 2015 Royal Albert Hall performance, the one where the sign language interpreter exposed the truth, was the most honest performance he ever gave. For 45 years, I hid behind that song, used it as a shield, pretended it was just music. But that night, I couldn't pretend. Everyone knew what it meant. Everyone knew who it was about. Everyone knew she was sitting right there, and I had to sing it anyway, honestly, vulnerably, without the armor of pretense. He pauses. The deaf audience heard something that night that hearing audiences almost never do, the truth beneath the performance, not because they could hear better, but because someone showed them what to look for. Someone translated not just the words, but the wounds those words came from. Sometimes the people who can't hear understand us better than those who can, because they're watching what we're actually saying, not just the words we choose.